Chapter 46, Ecosystems. As we've defined earlier, an ecosystem is the community of living organisms. Remember, this is multiple species, and their interactions with the non-living parts of their environment, the rocks, the water, the sunshine, the temperature, etc. Now, ecosystems can be defined into three basic groups, which include two aquatic major groups and one terrestrial. And so, as we saw in Chapter 44, there are terrestrial or land ecosystems, otherwise known as biomes. There are freshwater ecosystems, and there are ocean water ecosystems. Now, the ocean water is the largest group, covering over 70% of the Earth's surface, whereas the freshwater is the smallest amount of ecosystems with only 1.8% of the Earth's surface. For any ecosystem, remember that this is not a static situation. It's not unmoving, but rather we hope that our ecosystems are at a state of equilibrium, a steady state where the organisms are in balance. So there may be a coming and going of numbers of living organisms, but they're not holding still and within their environment. And this equilibrium indicates a vibrant, healthy, and evolving ecosystem. Now, ecosystems do change, and as a way of assessing how well the ecosystem handles its change, we can look at two parameters. One is called resistance. So this is the ability for an ecosystem to stay at that equilibrium despite having some problems. So a disturbance could be a problem. It could be a natural problem, like say a fire comes through or there's a toxic spill into the ocean. So it could be a natural occurrence or it could be a man-made occurrence. And so the health of the ecosystem can be measured, its ability to resist any of these problems. And then resilience is the speed at which an ecosystem can get better after being disturbed. So the most healthy ecosystems are able to resist, and if they do have disturbances, then they are able to come back quickly. Here are some examples of ecosystems showing a tide pool, so just this little area, versus the entire rainforest in Brazil. So this is a very small ecosystem. This is a very large ecosystem. So they can range in size. Additionally, even within the same type of ecosystem, so this is a desert biome, this is a desert biome, we see that the landscape is really different. So even within the same kind of ecosystem, you can have a lot of variety. So one important thing within an ecosystem is to look at the relationships between the living organisms through what we call a feeding scheme. So this is a food chain, and you've probably seen these before in other classes. And when we talk about food chains, we're talking about a very simple feeding scheme. It's a linear sequence. So you notice we start, and you always start at the bottom of these food chains. You start at the bottom and you move up in a straight line. So that's where it gets its name, a linear sequence, from one organism to the next, to the next, to the next. So each organism occupies a particular level, which we call a trophic level. So this is one trophic level, this would be the next, this would be the next, this would be the next. And so therefore, the organisms on this level will eat these organisms. Organisms on this level will eat these. And then at the very top, they will eat the next level down. Now within the food chain, we have some definitions. So at the very bottom, we have what we call the primary producer. So the primary producer is the one that can make food. So it's either going to be a plant or a bacteria or a eukaryote that can photosynthesize. So these are mostly photosynthetic organisms, and they are able to utilize sunlight in order to produce food. And so they form the basis or the bottom of the food chain. Next, so these are the producers. They're making the food. The next level up, we have our first level of consumers. So a consumer means they're going to eat the level down. So our primary consumer eats the primary producer. The secondary consumers, which are usually carnivores. So these are often herbivores because they're eating plants and other photosynthetic organisms. The next level down is usually a carnivore that's going to eat the primary consumers. And then this may have many levels, but we've only got 3 levels to it. Once you get to the top level consumer, in this case it's tertiary because there's only 3 levels of consumers. But if you have more than 3, then we call it the apex consumer, meaning apex is at the top. This is the highest level consumer within this ecosystem. Now, for each trophic level, producer, then each level of consumers, we have an input of energy. So for the producers, that energy is originating from the sun, and then for photosynthetic organisms, and then that energy is captured by the producers and is going to be available to pass on to upper levels. So you notice in this representative graph, we see energy content. And remember, energy is neither created nor destroyed. It can just be transferred to something else. We're going to start off and look at our primary producers at the bottom of the food chain. So here is the amount of energy that they are going to take in and convert to food. Now, how much of this energy gets passed on to the next level? So here's our primary consumers who are going to be eating the primary producers. And we see that that level is greatly reduced. And then how much of this energy gets passed to the secondary consumers, and then how much of that gets passed to the tertiary consumers. So we see every time we go up, there is a reduction at each level, and the most energy is always at the very bottom level. So again, energy is never lost completely, but it's converted. So what's happening is that this energy is going to be converted into heat and in that, pulled out of living organisms. Now, this next diagram is probably also a term that you've heard. This is a food web. Food web. Now, a food web is a more complex but non-linear representation of a feeding scheme. Now, a food web has many, many more components, and it's not linear. You don't start with one and go straight up a line. You see that one species may feed many different species, and you see that there's many different producers here at the bottom level. So this is really more representative of the actual occurrence within an ecosystem. So as we saw before, there was a straight line. And that's good if you want to look at specific species and how they are interacting another specific species. But if you want to look at the ecosystem as a whole, this is a much more accurate representation of what's happening in an ecosystem. So we talked about the fact that energy was really important in transferring from one level of a trophic feeding scheme to the next. So let's look at the names again for the different members as far as how they eat. So remember, and we've talked about this before, we have photo, autotrophs. So these are organisms like plants, algae, and photosynthetic bacteria. So these are the ones that are going to serve as the majority energy producers for the world's ecosystems. They're going to make most of the energy by capturing the energy in sunlight and converting it to a food source. Next, we have the heterotrophs. So these are the different, hetero means different feeders, meaning they can't make their own food. They need to acquire energy by eating living or previously living organisms. So those two we have talked about in depth before, but we're going to have another group to introduce here. These are the chemoautotrophs. So they've got that word auto in there, so we know that they are able to self-feed. But they don't have the word photo. Instead, we're replacing that with chemo. So instead of using energy from the sun, hence photo, they're going to use energy trapped in other molecules. Like a good example is hydrogen sulfide. They're going to take molecules like that and use the energy locked up in those molecules and use that to produce their own food, such as glucose. So they're going to do this without any sunlight. And these organisms, although they're a very small component of our ecosystems, do exist. And they exist in dark places, such as caves or hydrothermal vents at the bottom of the ocean where there is no sunlight. So just so that you know that photoautotrophs are not the only producers that are in the ecosystems. So now let's look at productivity within trophic levels. So how is energy passed and how do we add to the organisms at different levels within the feeding scheme? So in this scheme, we see sunlight and we're actually going downward instead of upward. But remember, there's a certain amount of energy which is made relayed to the Earth's atmosphere, and then primary producers, whichever primary producer we're talking about, plants, algae, etc., depending on what particular ecosystem they're in, are going to be able to capture a certain amount of this energy, and they're going to be able to incorporate that into their body mass. So their biomass is the amount of energy trapped in the living organisms within a level. So this pink bar refers to their biomass in energy form. This blue is the amount that they are able to take in. So you notice that these numbers are different. The blue is the gross primary productivity. This is the rate at which that the producers can utilize the energy coming from the sun. And then this is the amount that is actually locked up in their body structures. So you notice there's a loss here. Where does that loss end up? Well, we're going to lose some of that in respiration and heat. So this is a loss. And by loss, I don't mean that energy is completely going away. It's just being transferred to a different form. And then additionally, we eventually are going to lose some as animals die and to the decomposers. But for right now, we're looking at the difference between this amount coming in from the sun and what's actually incorporated into the body of the organisms, which is the net primary productivity. Primary productivities we're looking at as at the producer level. We're going to be able to take this portion of the 20,000 and incorporate it into the bodies, and this portion is going to be lost to heat. And if you add those two numbers up, you get the number in the blue. So if we want to actually calculate what is a measurement of that ability to then pass energy on to the next level. So here's how much energy is trapped within the body of the primary producers. We're going to pass that energy on to the next level, the primary consumers, and we see that now this amount of energy is going to be passed on. We're going to lose some of that energy to decomposers. So some of these plants, algae, etc., are going to die, and so decomposers are going to take care of them. But we're really only going to pass this much on to be eaten by the next level. And so if we want to measure what the effectiveness of that energy passed on, we want to see, okay, how much of this can be incorporated in the bodies of the primary consumers, and that number is here. So we look at the production at the present trophic level, so that's what's in the pink box, and we divide that by the production at the previous level. So we're looking for a transfer. So of this total here, only this amount gets incorporated into the bodies of the next level. So we take this number, the 1103, and divide it by the 7618, and we multiply it by 100 to get a percent, and we see that only 14.5% of the energy from the producers is actually transferred to the primary consumers. And we can do that for each level if we wanted to. We could then move on and look at 111 divided by 1103 and calculate at the next level. We see that there'll be a decreasing amount passed on at each level. Now if we want to look and see how efficiently at each level, within each level, do the organisms within this level utilize the energy which is given to them. So that's what we call the net production efficiency, or the NPE, the net production efficiency. So within this level, we want to see the primary consumers are given this much energy from which is passed to them, but they're only able to assimilate or put into their bodies this amount of energy. So how efficient are they at doing that? Well, we can figure that out. 1103 divided by 3373 times 100, they're roughly 33% efficient at converting that energy. If we move up to the next level, 111 divided by 383, because of this energy, only 383 is going to be transferred to the secondary consumers, and of that, they're only going to use 111 units. We can divide that number by 383 times 100, 29%. So we're seeing a reduction in the ability at each trophic level to assimilate the energy that's used. And that's primarily because as we move up the trophic levels, organisms are having to utilize their energy often in order to keep themselves warm. So they're transferring a lot of this energy into heat that they're going to use in order to maintain their body temperature. So a lot of tertiary consumers and a lot of secondary consumers are going to be endotherms. Remember, endotherms versus ectotherms? Endotherms are going to have to maintain their body temperature. There certainly are some secondary consumers who are ectotherms, but a lot of primary consumers may fall into that group of being an ectotherm, and therefore they don't need as much energy to be used as heat. Another way to represent these relationships of biomass and energy transfer is to use a slightly different visual representation called an ecological pyramid. So here we see the transfer of biomass in units as we go up a food chain or a food web. So we see here we have a fairly large number in the plants, and then as we move up to primary consumers, secondary consumers, tertiary consumers, we're seeing that there is less biomass being able to be incorporated. Therefore, there's less of these organisms. There's many more plants than there are insects and snails, and many more fish at the secondary level than there is at this primary level. And at the tertiary level, we're going to have the fewest number of organisms. We can also see this in a different kind of ecosystem, and in this instance, we see that the primary consumers, actually there seems to be more. This is a variant where we see, why is there more here than there was at the primary producer level? That's because these phytoplankton are being eaten so quickly, but they're able to reproduce themselves so much that they really are still keeping up with supplying the next level up. But if you see that and wonder, why is this inverted? That's why. When we then look at number of individuals, we're going to see the same kind of thing. So this is biomass in weight, but this is actual numbers. So here we have 1.5 million plants, which can support 200,000 insects, which can support only 90,000 insects at the secondary level, which can support only one bird. So if for some reason we had 5 birds come into this grassland ecosystem, this biome, then that would greatly impact this ecosystem and cause problems. And then lastly, if we see the flow of energy, again, this was the same thing we saw in that previous flow chart where we had this many units of energy coming in and being assimilated by the plants, and then this amount is being transferred to the primary consumers, a much lower amount. This amount is being supplied to the secondary consumers, and only this amount of energy to the tertiary consumers. So we can really only support levels that will be covered by the previous level. So if, for example, something occurred and wiped out this secondary level, then we're probably going to wipe out the tertiary level as well, because there's nothing for them to feed off of. And then the last section for this part of Chapter 46 is the fact that we have consequences to our food web. And as we look at the decreases in biomass, remember that as we look at our primary consumers, we're going to have very many more of them. As we go up, we're going to have fewer and fewer and fewer. This means that materials can be concentrated. So if you have a toxic or persistently bad substance that is present in the ecosystem, a pollutant, then it can be spread out over many, many zebra mussels. But as increasing consumers eat those and we have fewer numbers of them, those toxicants aren't going to go away. They're going to be accumulated in fewer numbers of bodies of these organisms as we go up. And we see that as we get to the tertiary or the apex consumer, then we have what's called a biomagnification. So an increased concentration of a toxic substance because we have fewer animals at this upper level. In this particular chart, we're showing PCBs, which is a known environmental contaminant, and then it's going to increase as we go up the food chain or the food web from the primary producers to the apex consumers. And then who is the very apex of apex? It could be humans. And so this is why we have to be careful about the foods that we eat. We see this not only with PCBs, but with mercury levels and other toxicants that can be found in apex consumers. So this will finish this section of Chapter 46, and we will continue it in the next lecture.